Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to learn about the cerebrum. Cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It makes almost 85% of the brain. It controls all the five senses of the body. That is the sense of smell, the sense of taste, the sense of hearing, the sense of vision, and the sense of touch. It also controls the judgment, the reasoning, the problem solving, the emotions, and learning. It also have something to do with the consolidation of the memory and emotions. The cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres. Now coming toward this diagram, in this diagram we can see that the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres. This is the cerebrum and this is the right hemisphere, and this is the left hemisphere. The right and left hemisphere are divided by a deep groove. This is a deep groove and this is called longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure divide the right and left hemisphere. On the surface of the brain, there exist small grooves. Uh, I'm going to maximize this photo. In this photo, we can see that these are small grooves on the surface of the brain, and these grooves are called sulci, and the single is sulcus. So, in between two groove, there is a ridge. There is a ridge in between two groove, and that ridge is called gyrus. So on the surface of the cerebrum there exist the gyrus and sulcus, sulci and gyri and sulci. So gyri are the ridges on the surface of the brain, or the surface of the cerebrum, while sulci are the grooves on the surface of the brain. So if the groove is a deep groove, is called fissure. For instance, which fissure? The longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is the deep groove which divide. This is the longitudinal fissure. This is a deep groove which divide the right and left hemisphere. The right and left hemisphere are connected with each other with the help of a white matter that is called corpus callosum. I am going to tell about that later. The whole hemisphere, the right and left hemisphere, are divided into four lobes. These are the four lobes. This is an imaginary diagram. In this diagram we can see that this is the frontal side and this is the dorsal side of the cerebrum. On the frontal side exists the frontal lobe, and on the dorsal side exists the which lobe? The occipital lobe. This is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. Each of the lobe is having a specific boundary over there, which is represented by sulcuses or sulci. So there are four major parts of the each hemisphere. That is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. These are the four main lobes which are there in each hemisphere. The names of the lobes are given by the bone which cover that lobe. For example, the frontal lobe is covered by the frontal bone of the cranium. The parietal lobe of the brain is covered by the parietal bone of the cranium. The occipital lobe of the cerebrum is covered by the occipital bone of the cranium, and the temporal lobe of the cerebrum is covered by the temporal bone of the cranium. That's why we have given these name. These names are given to the cerebrum. Beside these four lobes, the cerebrum is also having a pip part that is not conspicuous on the surface. That exists deep inside the cerebrum, and that exists over here deeply. But before going to that part, first of all, we should know that each of the lobe is having uh, a definite boundary, or a specific boundary. This the frontal lobe. The frontal and parietal lobe are differentiated from each other, are divided from each other by the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus. The central sulcus divide the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This is called parieto-occipital sulcus. This parieto-occipital sulcus divide the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Similarly, the lateral sulcus, this is the lateral sulcus, and the lateral sulcus divide the temporal lobe from the rest of the brain. Divide the temporal lobe from the rest of the part of the cerebrum. So all of these are the lobe. But if we go deeply inside this fissure, or this sulcus, if we remove this sulcus, we will get another surface over there inside, and that surface will be here. This is the inside surface. This is the parietal lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. In between the parietal and temporal lobe, there is a sulcus. This is called lateral sulcus, and inside the lateral sulcus, there is another surface which is hidden. This surface, this is called insula. This is the pep part of the cerebrum. This is the pep part of each cerebral hemisphere. This is called insula, and this insula is covered by this area of the insula is called operculum. This area of the insula is called operculum, which cover the insula. So insula and operculum are the part of the insula and operculum. Insula and operculum are the fifth part of each hemisphere, of each cerebral hemisphere. This was about the insula and operculum. Now coming toward the next slide. In this slide, we can see that this is the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus, and beside the central sulcus, on the frontal lobe, there is a gyrus, and that gyrus is called precentral gyrus. Over here, this is the precentral gyrus, which is represented by red color. So this is the central sulcus. Beside the central sulcus, on the frontal lobe, are adjacent to the central sulcus, on the frontal lobe, there is a gyrus, and that gyrus is called precentral gyrus. This is very important gyrus on the frontal lobe. This is called precentral gyrus, and this precentral gyrus is having primary motor cortex, or primary motor area. Precentral gyrus encloses the primary motor cortex. This red color represents the precentral gyrus, and this precentral gyrus contain the primary motor cortex, and this primary motor cortex control all the motor functions of the body. This control all the motor neurons of the somatic nervous system. So it control all the motor function of the body. This gyrus is called precentral gyrus, which is adjacent to the central sulcus. Now in the next slide, we can see that this is the central sulcus, and adjacent to the central sulcus, on the parietal lobe, the green color, the green color band, this gyrus is called postcentral gyrus. This gyrus is on the parietal lobe, post central gyrus. And this post-central gyrus represent what? This post-central gyrus represent the somatosensory area. So it represents the somatosensory cortex. So uh, it control all the somatic neuron, uh, which comes from the sensory nervous system. It control all the sensory function of the somatic nervous system. It control all the sensory functions of the somatic nervous system. It receive all the neuron from the sensory nervous system or somatic nervous system. It receive. So this is called somatosensory cortex or somatosensory area, and this gyrus is called postcentral gyrus. This gyrus is called postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus exists adjacent to the central gyrus on the parietal lobe, while the precentral gyrus exists on the frontal cortex or the frontal lobe adjacent to the central sulcus. But the fourth central gyrus control all the motor function of the body, and the precentral gyrus control all the motor function of the body, while the fourth central gyrus control all the sensory functions of the body. It control all the sensory functions of the body, or it receive all the sensory information of the body. So this is called somatosensory area. Now, in this diagram, we can see that this area is called corpus callosum. This is a white matter. This is called corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the area which connect the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere. The corpus callosum connect the right and left hemisphere of the brain, or right and left hemisphere of the cerebrum. Corpus callosum. Corpus callosum connect the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. And this corpus callosum is made up of white matter. This is made up of white matter. And now in this diagram, we can see that this area, from this area to this area, these are represented from this area to this area. This represents the area from this to this portion. I'm going to make it over here. We can see that from this area to this area, this is represented in this diagram from this area to this area. So this is defected from this area to this area. So this area of the brain, or this area of the cerebrum, or this area of the somatosensory area, or motor cortex, control the sensory and motor function of the pharynx. This controls the sensory and motor function of the pharynx. Similarly, this portion control the sensory and motor function of the tongue. This is represented in this area. Sensory and motor function of the tongue. This area represent the sensory and motor. This control the sensory and motor function of the lips. This is represented over here in this. Similarly, this control the sensory and motor functions of the face. Similarly, this control the sensory and motor function of the nose. This control the sensory and motor function of the eyes, and this control the sensory and motor function of the neck. So from this area to this area represent the sensory and motor function of the pharynx to the neck. From this area to this area, almost to this area, This control the sensory and motor function of the from pharynx to the neck. Now, in the next slide, we can see that the another domain start over here. This area control the sensory and motor function of the fingers. This comes almost in this area. This control the sensory and motor functions of the hands. This control the sensory and motor function of the wrist, and this control the sensory and motor function of the elbow. This control the sensory and motor function of the shoulder. So from this area to this area, the sensory and motor function from the shoulder to finger are being controlled. This area to this area control the sensory and motor function of the shoulder. Roughly from this area to this area, the sensory and motor function from the fingers to the shoulder are being controlled. And we can see over here that the fingers are having large area. The fingers are represented by very large area, though very small in size as compared to other parts of the body, but this is having large area because fingers are very important in the various functions. In this diagram, we can see that this area represent the sensory and motor function of the trunk. The sensory and motor function of the trunk are being controlled by this area. Sensory and motor function of the trunk. Similarly, the sensory and motor function of the hip is controlled by this area, and the sensory and motor function of the knee is controlled by this area, almost this area. This area controls the sensory and motor function of the knee. This controls sensory and motor function of the hip, and this controls the sensory and motor function of the trunk. Similarly, in the next slide, this area controls the sensory and motor function of the ankle, and the second last area control the sensory and motor function of the toe. Similarly, in the last slide, in the last area control the sensory and motor function of the genital. It controlled only the sensory functions of the genital, not the motor function of the genital. It only controlled the sensory functions of the genital. But we can see over here that each and every portion is having a different slide. The finger is having a big area for controlling. The from pharynx to the neck, the portion is very small, but this is represented by a very large area, because from the neck to the pharynx there is a very big area, or the facial area of the body, that is very important. The lips, the face, the nose, all of these are very important. So these are having a very large area in the somatosensory and the motor cortex. So from the hand to the shoulder, this is also a very small area. This is also a very small area, but represented by a very large portion of the brain, especially the fingers. Then from the trunk to the genital, or from the trunk to the toe, this is a very large area, but represented by a very small portion of the brain. But over here we can see that in the last part over here, on the last part, the genital controlling area is there, which control the sensory area of the genital, which control the sensory information of the genital, uh, which is there, which is considered as the safest place of the brain, which is there on the safest place of the brain, or the cerebrum. Now, it should be also kept in mind that the right side of the brain, this is the right hemisphere and this is the left hemisphere. This is something weird about the cerebrum, that the right cerebral hemisphere control the functions of the left side of the body. For example, this area represents the fingers. So this is the right hemisphere. So on the right hemisphere, this area will control the fingers of the left side of the body, and the finger of side of the body will be controlled on this surface or this area. The finger of the right side of the body will be controlled by this area, and the finger of the left side of the body will be controlled by this area. So the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere, and the right area of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere. This is something about the weird about the cerebrum. I'm going to write it here that the left side of the body is controlled by the right cerebral hemisphere, and the right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere of the cerebrum or cerebral hemisphere. So one thing more about the cerebrum, that cerebral, there is a special terminology about the cerebral dominance. Cerebral dominance. If a person is right-handed, then he is left cerebral dominant. If a person is left-handed, he is. If a person is right-handed, he is left cerebral dominant. If a person is left-handed, then he is right cerebral dominant. If the prominent functions of the brain is controlled by the if the prominent functions of the brain is controlled by the right hemisphere, then he is uh, a left dominant. If if the prominent function of the brain is if the prominent function of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere, prominent function of the body is controlled by right hemisphere, then he is right cerebral dominant. Or if the prominent function of the brain is control of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere, then he is the left cerebral dominant. And the left cerebral dominant will always be right-handed, while the right cerebral dominant will always be left-handed. Similarly, in the next slide, we can see that these are the different lobes. This is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is having various parts. Are the occipital, coming toward the occipital one. The occipital lobe is very dorsal of the cerebrum, and at the very dorsal part of the occipital lobe there is the visual cortex. This area is called visual cortex, and visual cortex is responsible for the vision. Now coming towards this one, visual cortex is very important, and visual cortex is located where? Visual cortex is located on the very dorsal side of the occipital lobe, and it control what? It control the vision. This is responsible for the eyesight or vision. Now in this lobe we can see the the temporal lobe. On the temporal lobe, this blue color area represent the auditory cortex. This blue color area represent the auditory cortex, but this auditory cortex is not only superficial, this also goes deep inside this area. So this is auditory cortex, and auditory cortex control the sense of hearing. Auditory cortex. Auditory cortex is located where? Auditory cortex is located on the parietal under temporal lobe, and this control the sense of hearing. It controls the sense of hearing. This is located just below the central sulcus on the temporal lobe, but this goes deeply inside this area. This I'm going to uh, come to this point in the next slide also. Now in this area represented by the yellow color, this represents the olfactory cortex. The olfactory cortex. This is also very important one. The olfactory cortex. The olfactory cortex is there, and this is responsible for the detection or interpretation of what? Of smell. This is responsible for the sense of smell, for the control of the sense of smell. This is olfactory cortex, and this is always there on the temporal lobe below the frontal cortex. This is the frontal cortex or the frontal lobe. Below the frontal lobe, below the frontal part of the frontal lobe, there is olfactory cortex on the temporal lobe. It controls the sense of smell. Now this red color represent the a special type of area. This is called Broca's area. Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for the formation of speech. This is responsible for speech. This is also called speech area. But there is one thing very important about the Broca's area, that the Broca's area exists only on one hemisphere. It will either be on the right hemisphere or on the left hemisphere. If a person is right cerebral dominant, then it will be on the right cerebral hemisphere, or if a person is left cerebral dominant, then it will be on the left cerebral hemisphere. This will only be on the one cerebral hemisphere, but all the other area which I have discussed over here, this also exists on the right hemisphere and left hemisphere. The visual cortex, the auditory cortex exists on the right hemisphere and left hemisphere both. The olfactory cortex exists on the right and left hemisphere, but this will be there on the Broca's area will be either on the right hemisphere or on the left hemisphere. Similarly, this control the function, or this control the movement of the tongue while formation of the speech. During the formation of the speech, the movement of the tongue is controlled by this area. For the along with the control of the vocal cord also. Now in this diagram we can see that this is the right cerebral hemisphere and this is the left cerebral hemisphere. In the right cerebral hemisphere we can see that this area and this area is the insula, and this is insula and operculum. This is insula and operculum, but inside over here, that on the insula and operculum, and the insula and frontal operculum, there is a cortex. There is an area that is called gustatory cortex. There is an area that is called gustatory cortex, which is responsible for the detection of taste. That is responsible for the detection of taste. Gustatory cortex. Gustatory cortex is responsible for the detection of what? For the detection of taste and flavor. But where is the gustatory cortex located? The gustatory cortex is located on the insula and frontal operculum. The gustatory cortex, I'm going to write it here. Gustatory cortex is located where? On the insula and frontal operculum. So we cannot see this area from the surface. This area cannot be seen from the surface, and this area is responsible for the detection of taste. We get the signal of taste to this area. From this area, we get the detection of taste. So this area is represented by the insula and operculum, and this exists. This is called as gustatory cortex. We cannot see this area on the surface, and this area exists over here below the central sulcus, below the central sulcus. If we remove operculum from this area and from this area, and over there we can see that this is over there is an insula and operculum, and on the insula and frontal operculum there is a gustatory cortex, which is responsible for the detection of taste. Now over here, this area, this green color area represents the auditory cortex, which I have explained in the previous slide. Over here, this blue color area, this area, this is auditory cortex, which goes deep inside this area, which goes deep this area. This is auditory cortex. This is below the lateral sulcus, and this control this control all the auditory sensation. This control all the auditory sense of hearing.